So today's topic is about nationalism, and well, nationalism is one of the more important ideologies in terms of the last at least 200 years, I suppose, at least since 1848, which is, you can learn about another time. But we'll look today at the debate about the meaning of nation, so how do we define what a nation is, and more importantly about nationalism, which is an argument that says the nation is morally important in some way, in lots of different ways, but in some way. So today we're going to consider two important forms of nationalism, civic and ethnic nationalism, and I'll argue that we can basically divide most forms of nationalism into one of these. Right? And we'll look at the major differences between civic and ethnic nationalism, what do they mean, what do they want, and how are they constructing their arguments. And we'll look at the way that a nation has been considered by different political theorists. So, whenever we look at nation, the immediate thing you notice is that there's lots of different competing definitions of what a nation is, and they're all based on different characteristics, and there's no real universal agreement about what constitutes a nation. Okay, I've given some examples here. So Otto Bauer says a nation is a group of people united by a common fate, possessing a common character. So the common fate is decided by a shared history, a common history that a group of people have together. And a common national character is almost necessarily a uniformity of language. So for Bauer, nations need two things. They need to share history and they need to share a language. All right, that's it. So for Max Weber, who we looked at earlier in the semester, a nation is a community of sentiment adequately manifesting itself in a state of its own. In other words, a community that produces a state. That's a nation. If you've got the state, you're a nation. If you haven't, you can't be a nation. Okay? Then we have Anthony Smith, who says a nation is a human population sharing a bunch of things, myths and memories, mass public culture, a homeland, economic unity, equal rights and duties. Right? So it's based on the stuff that you share. Then we have Benedict Anderson, who argues that a nation is an imagined political community, and that it's imagined both in terms of the limits and its sovereignty. So Anderson will argue that any group of people bigger than a small village is probably this imagined community. If you live in a village, you probably know everybody in the village, right? You've met everybody, you know everybody, probably by a young age. Okay. The difference in bigger communities, like, I don't know, China's a great example, right? How do you ever meet a billion people? You can't, right? So it's not a real community. In a real community, everybody knows each other, everybody talks to each other, there's this shared bond, right? Big countries, and any country beyond, one that's small enough that you can know everybody, is an imagined community, right? You imagine this connection that you have with people, but you don't actually have a connection with everybody in practice. But for Anderson, it doesn't really matter whether this connection is genuine or false. It doesn't matter if you never meet all the people in your country, right? What matters is that there is this imagination of this connectedness that you have, right? And because people imagine themselves as being connected, that turns it into being real, right? Whether or not it's actually real, it makes it real. And then we have James Kellis, who says that a nation is a group of people who feel themselves to be bound together by ties of history, culture, or ancestry. He says that nations have both objective characteristics, like territory that they control, language that they speak, religious beliefs, or common descent. But they also have subjective characteristics. And the most important subjective characteristic is, does a group of people actually have national consciousness? Do they believe that they should be a nation or not? Without this subjective component, even if people have common language, territory, culture, something else, right? If they don't believe that they need to be a nation, they're not going to be a nation, right? Nobody's going to act politically and try and become a nation, right? So subjective consciousness is important as well. Now, if we look at all of these definitions, what brings them together is this idea of a collective thing, right? Nations obviously require more than just an individual. They're all collectivist arguments. They're saying that a nation is a group of people in some way, right? But they disagree about pretty much everything else, right? Is a nation common fatal character? Is a nation a shared language? Is it common sentiments? Is it a political project? Is it myths and memories and history? Is it the homeland of a people? Is it an economic entity or a unity? Is it national consciousness? Or is it a combination between some or all of these things? Right? There's no universal agreement about this. So, in political theory, nations are interesting not based on whether they objectively exist or not. You know, we can look outside and say that, oh, these people in this territory speak this language, or have this passport, or have this state, or have something else that brings them together, right? For political theory, that's not a very interesting thing, right? What is interesting is the way people feel about nations. What is interesting in the way people construct arguments about, is the nation a morally important thing? You know, questions like, should we value the nation? Should we value our nation just because it's ours? Should we value the nation as a thing? Is it important? And is it permissible to discriminate against people who are not from our nation, either by liking people from our nation more, or liking people not from our nation less, or by treating people from our nation more favorably, or treating people who are not from our nation less favorably? How do we morally justify this sort of behavior? Right? Nationalism attempts to answer that question in a specific way. Right? So it's one of the major questions that it tries to answer. So in other words, nationalism is interesting for political theorists, but then what is nationalism? Well, Gellner says nationalism is a theory of political legitimacy. It basically says if you have an ethnic boundary, you know, a distinct group of people, that should correspond to a political boundary. You know, we should draw political boundaries, draw the boundaries and borders of countries around ethnic groups. And we shouldn't have a crossover between ethnic and political boundaries. In other words, Gellner argues for a world of nation states, where every single national group should have its own state, and there shouldn't be multinational states. Now, we can see that's immediately controversial because some of the biggest countries in the world are multinational states. China, India, Russia, probably the United States, all multinational states, right? Now, nationalism is arguing, to an extent, that this shouldn't happen, right? At least Gellner's arguing that it shouldn't happen, okay? Next we have Kaduri, who says nationalism holds that humanity is naturally divided into nations. In other words, that it's part of our human nature to divide ourselves into nations. This is a sort of argument that human beings have always been tribal people and that the nation is just a bigger form of the tribe, okay? So nations are known by certain characteristics which we can ascertain, and the only legitimate type of government is national self-government. In other words, again, this is an argument that multinational states should not exist. Individual nations should govern themselves, right? And then lastly, by nationalism, I mean the sentiment of belonging to a community whose members identify with a set of symbols, beliefs, and ways of life, and who have the common will to decide on their common political destiny, right? So there's another definition of nationalism based on identity and symbols and beliefs and stuff like that as being the basis of what a nation is. So, nations are things which we can objectively measure. We can point to where their border is, we can point to their state power, we can identify their sovereignty, that sort of thing. By contrast, nationalism is an idea, it's a doctrine or a theory that says the nation is historically and morally important, that it should be treated with a special significance. Right? So, one of the biggest differences immediately between nationalism and some of the other ideologies we've looked at during the semester is that nationalism is what we call a particularist argument. It says that national boundaries are morally significant, and this one particular nation that we're in is morally significant more so than other nations. You know, so most ideologies we've looked at are universalist. In other words, let's give some examples of universalism. Liberalism says all individuals are significant everywhere, and that everybody should have the same rights subject to the harm principle and all the other stuff that liberal says, right? But concepts like universal human rights say that everybody everywhere should have human rights. It's a universal argument, it applies to everybody, right? Nationalism is arguing from the perspective of specific nations and saying members of that nation should like that nation more than other nations, right? It's not saying everybody should like that nation, I guess. Oh, sorry, I blanked out the screen. So we can divide nationalism into two basic types, civic nationalism and ethnic nationalism. Let's look at what these are briefly. So civic nationalists will argue that when we belong to a nation, it's kind of like a rational decision that we're making, right? So Ignatieff, for example, says a civic nation is a community of equal, rights-bearing citizens, and what unites them is their attachment to a shared set of political practices or values. It doesn't really matter what those practices are. So for example, some nationalism in the United States, not all, there's definitely ethnic nationalism in the United States, but some types of nationalism in the United States is based around this concept of freedom and their attachment to freedom and being a free society, right? So this idea that everybody in the United States is free and constitutionally free and has a set of freedoms and all that sort of thing, that's the basis of their civic nationalism. In a similar way, like the Soviet Union when it existed was based on the concept of like socialism and the idea of a socialist society and a brotherhood of all nations within this idea of socialism. So both are examples of civic nationalism, where the country is formed around a set of principles or values, and the members of that country declare their patriotism towards those values. Right? So, by contrast, ethnic nationalism is a belief that being part of a nation is an inherent thing. Something that you get by being born, not something that you get by an idea that you follow. You know, you're born into a national group, it's an inherent ascribed thing. Right? So, for an ethnic nationalist, being part of a nation is defined in terms of ethnicity or in race. So there are some common features of nationalism. It implies that the individual's relationship to this collective that we're part of, is a non-voluntary thing. You don't choose the country that you're born in, certainly. You can later choose which country, you have some control over the country you live in. I left Australia and I moved here, right? So you have some choice over that. But you certainly don't choose the country you're born in. You certainly don't choose the nationality you start off with, right? Things like the language that you speak first, you have no control over that. It's completely determined by the environment you're born in. So nationalism then implies that you have a special relationship to this country and to its people, despite the fact that you didn't choose it. So you didn't choose it, it just happened to you, but it's special, right? And this is the weird part of the argument, because most of liberalism and most of the other ideologies put a lot of emphasis on choice. We have responsibility for the decisions we make, and choices that we make are significant, and we're allowed to determine our identity in lots of different ways. Nationalists are arguing the opposite thing here. They're like, well, you don't choose your country, but it's special, you have to like it, right? So how do they do this? How do they accomplish this? Because they're not just arguing that. They're not just arguing that you have a special relationship to your country and its people. They're also arguing that you're permitted, and it's sometimes required, to discriminate either positively in favor of your people or negatively against people who are not from your nation, right? So nationalism also involves belonging to a nation, and that involves people who don't belong to a nation. It makes no sense to talk about a nation without talking about people who are not part of that nation. So it both includes and excludes people. Right? So nationalists therefore have to make three arguments if they're to convince you that nationalism is a good idea. Firstly, they have to justify the non-voluntariness. Why should we like something that we didn't choose and that we haven't contributed to in any way, right? When you get born in a country, it might be the best country ever, it might be the worst country ever, but you didn't choose it and you didn't make it the best or the worst. You had nothing to do with it. You just exist suddenly, right? Why should you have a connection to something you didn't choose? Secondly, partiality. Why should we treat something better than something else at all? Why should we value our nation more than other nations? Do we have good reason for that? And thirdly, exclusion. How do we justify including and excluding people based on certain criteria? So if we look at liberalism and nationalism, the default position is that they probably should not agree with each other. You know that liberalism takes individuals as the most important thing. The most significant thing is the individual. Whereas nationalism takes the nation as the most significant thing, a collective, not the individual. All right, so liberalism is a universalist ideology. It says principles of liberalism should apply to everyone, everywhere. Every individual, everywhere should be free. Right? Nationalism is a particularist ideology that says particular nations are more important than others. Okay? So how do these ideas coincide? How do they somehow find a way where they can coexist within the same belief system? Now, interestingly, historically, liberalism and nationalism have gone together in political programs, and these ideas became successful at the same time as each other. You see that the time in human history where liberalism starts to become more influential is exactly the same time that nationalism starts to become more successful and influential. Right? So even if they seem like they're totally opposed, there has to be something that links them together. Right? And one of the things that links them together is that when nations as a whole argue for freedom, argue for self-government, argue for self-determination, they're effectively making liberal arguments on a collective level, saying that individual nations should be free to make their own choices. Individual nations should be free to govern themselves, should be free to make decisions about their destiny. That's taking a liberal argument and taking it from the individual to a larger group of people and applying it. Right? Self-determination works as well on the individual level as it does on the national level. So here we have Rousseau, who was a French political theorist and did a lot of other things, wrote books, composed music, much more interesting people than we have around today. I've said this before. So his most famous book is On the Social Contract, and I suggest you read it, right? It's not that long, mercifully. It's one of the few political theory books that isn't something you can use to hold a door open, right? It's just a couple, like 100 pages or so. Rousseau was famous for influencing the French Revolution. He died before the French Revolution actually happened, but his ideas were incredibly influential in setting up this idea that, well, the nation owes us something, and that there's a way of thinking as a liberal that leads to nationalism. All right, let's look at the main concept, which is called the general will. Now, Rousseau says the link here between individualism and nationalism is through the general will. And he's arguing here that every nation has a general will, which is not just the individual's will, and it's not like the utilitarian argument where you take everybody's individual choice and add it together in a big pile. No, it's like every nation has a general will that is bigger and more important than each individual's will by itself or added together. And importantly, only by recognizing this general will, only when a nation achieves its destiny through this general will, can individuals within that nation be free. So the determining fact about whether individuals can be free is whether the nation is recognizing its general will. Right? So here is an argument from a liberal standpoint that individual freedom is determined by national freedom. And that's the link between individual rights and nationalism. So for Rousseau, the general will happens, gets recognized when a nation becomes a sovereign democracy, when it makes decisions about itself, and when it starts doing that. That's the necessary component for the general will. So what are some particular problems with Rousseau's theory? I mean, he's trying to connect individuals and liberalism to nations and nationalism, and he's trying to use democracy as the way to make that connection. Now, as we've already seen, there is a bunch of conflicts between liberalism and democracy over property rights and, what can we actually do with most people's opinion? Does that give them the right to dominate minorities? Does that give them the right to take away people's property? Does that give them, the right to do lots of things? All right, so there's already conflicts between liberalism and democracy. How reliable is a connection between liberalism and nationalism by way of democracy? It seems like an incredibly complicated logical scenario. So democracy involves equally considering people's opinions, but it doesn't involve accepting everybody's opinions. Ultimately, some opinions get listened to and some opinions get ignored in any democracy. Right? So democratic outcomes involve individuals and groups both getting what they want and not getting what they want. For example, Russia and China are two countries with a leadership group that has a very high approval rate. You have like 70, 80% where people like the leaders, right, according to most surveys. In Australia, I think the approval rate of the political leaders ranges between like 30 to 40% most of the time. In other words, if you see 3 people, 2 of them don't like the government, no matter who the government is at any given time. Right? So most people are not happy with the current leaders, even though it's a democracy, so they decided who the leader is. Right? So they made a decision about who the leader is, and they don't like it no matter what, no matter who's in power. Okay? So, in other words, it's not a very reliable way of linking this individual choice to the concept of the nation. Because at any given time, most people in these nations don't like who's actually running the nation, don't like the way things are going, I guess. So, liberals argue that the reason people need rights is because they're scared of the majority. You know, either the majority is going to force them to be the type of person they don't want to be, force them to adopt a different lifestyle or culture or something like that. Or they're scared of the majority taking away their property and, you know, collectivizing it, I suppose. You know, so the threat of the majority exists with or without nationalism, but it seems that nationalism certainly raises this majority threat. You know, if you're a minority person and there's this big group of people, you're probably worried about what the big group of people are going to do to you, right? If nationalism takes hold amongst that big group of people and they start to become really conscious of themselves as a group of people and articulate their interests, particularly against you, that raises the threat, right? If you're a minority and nationalism is a thing, minorities suffer more the more popular nationalism becomes. So the second question is the question of nation states, and it's impossible to argue against the idea that some nations are stronger than others, some nations are weaker than others, whether that's economically, militarily, or some other way, right? Not every nation has the same amount of territory, not every nation has the same amount of wealth, not every nation has the same amount of power, right? So if liberals are arguing that individuals matter, isn't it the case that individuals should matter no matter what their nationality is, right? But clearly nationality changes the balance of resources that individuals get. You know, if you're lucky enough to be born in a rich country, right, you're much more likely to be successful at life than if you're born in a poor country. You know, if you're lucky enough to be born in a stable country, you're much more likely to be safe than if you're born in a conflict zone or a place where there's a war, right? Simple as that, right? So not all nations are equal. Therefore, how do we reconcile this idea of individuals being important with nations being unequal? So there's 2 basic arguments in favor of the nation state. Civic nationalists will argue, well, even if there are problems with the nation state, it's better than the alternative. Imagine a world without nation states. You know, how would that work? With no borders, anybody can go anywhere, there's no government, you know, we can just run free. You know, it's kind of like Hobbes' state of nature, where everything's crazy and chaotic, right? And then ethnic nationalists say that, well, individuals need culture. Without culture, you're kind of nothing. And cultures need the nation state. You know, cultures that have a nation state protecting and defending it have at least historically been more powerful, more able to survive and exist than cultures that don't have a nation state defending and protecting it. So ethnic nationalists will argue that individuals need culture as a way of expressing themselves, and that the nation state is the most reliable embodiment of culture. So therefore, despite any problems with the nation state, it's a necessary thing, right? So both civic and ethnic nationalists agree about this point. The state is necessary, the nation state is necessary. So let's now look at 2 different types of theorists who argue these points of view, right? Firstly, we have John Stuart Mill, who we've looked at a little bit in discussing freedom and liberalism. And in the book Considerations on Representative Government, Mill talks a lot about nationalism and the nation and how it should work. So Mill says in this book that free institutions are next to impossible in a country made up of different nationalities. So he's explicitly making an argument that multinational states are not viable. He's throwing down a gauntlet to countries like the United States or the Soviet Union when it existed, or China or India, or countries like that that are based on multiple nationalities coexisting, right? Mill is no ethnic nationalist. He doesn't think that people with different cultures can't agree with each other. He simply says that people need to agree with a set of political principles, in his case, liberal political principles, in order for a nation to coexist and exist. So for Mill, the biggest and most important thing is the idea that nations should be founded on a single language. Why is this? Well, he says that if the state allows for multiple major language groups to coexist, there will not be a national unified public opinion. There will be lots of different groups, each with their own literature, their own politics, their own political leaders, and there will be this big division based on language. Right? So what's the problem, right? Mill says that the biggest problem with this then is that the single national language is necessary because you need a single national state. If you imagine institutions like the army or the police or things like that divided by nation within a single state, then it's impossible to be completely obedient to the state institutions. You'll support the army more or less based on who's in charge of it. Right? So institutions like the army need popular legitimacy, otherwise they just make people annoyed and upset. Right? So when the Portuguese were governing Macau, for example, they, like all other colonial powers, tended to use foreign troops to govern the country. Right? Why would you use foreign troops? Because if you tell them to shoot into a crowd to break up a protest or a demonstration, they're much more likely to do it. If you use local troops, they're shooting at their friends and family members, much less likely to do it, right? So the British did this as well. They had, an empire made of all different nations and stuff, and whenever they wanted to conquer a new country, they'd use foreign troops, and they'd take the troops from that country and use them to suppress people in different countries, right? Genius logic. So the army needs popular legitimacy, otherwise it just makes people upset, right? So, and in particular, an army comprised of one particular national or ethnic group is much more likely to use force against another ethnic group, worsening these tensions. Right? So this is the reason Mill thinks multinational states are inherently unstable, inherently not going to work. So the next problem is that in multinational states, Mill argues that the state spends most of its time making political compromises and performing this balancing act between different ethnic groups. And as a result, the state is not using its power to develop the society as a whole. Now, over time, these differences in nationality are going to be institutionalized in government and law. The state is much weaker if it spends its time making political compromises than focusing on overall national development. So all of this leads Mill to a certain set of controversial claims. Firstly, Mill argues that a nation should prioritize a single language, right? And particularly in any environment where there are multiple nationalities and multiple languages, this is always going to be a dangerous and divisive argument. If that single language happens to be your language, then good for you. You can speak your mother tongue and use it to get good jobs in government and use it to get political power or anything that you want, right? But if the single national language is not your language, that's highly disadvantageous to you, right? You're going to have to go through the pain and effort of becoming literate in a second language just to compete on an equal level with this other group of people who are also part of your country, right? The second point that Mill argues is that blending nationalities is a good idea. Right? And this blending doesn't involve both sides making a compromise. It involves blending the smaller nationalities and assimilating them into the larger ones so that there's this unified national culture. Now we'll talk more about multiculturalism next week and about arguments for how different cultures can coexist with one another. But this argument that smaller groups should assimilate into the larger group sounds great from the perspective of the big group. It doesn't sound very good from the perspective of the small group, right? You lose all of your own traditions and culture and stuff like that. Right, so Mill is suggesting that we should subscribe to the nation based on it being a set of values that we have a political attachment to, not based on it being the culture that we're from or the language that we're from. We're attaching ourselves to a set of political principles, whatever those principles are. On the other hand, we have von Herder, who basically argues the ethnic nationalist perspective. And he says that human consciousness itself depends on language, and that language isn't just the way that we name things, it isn't just a means of communication. It connects us to a whole set of emotions and feelings and ideas that are not necessarily able to be felt in other languages. I'm sure this is a bilingual teaching environment, or at least the campus is an environment where there's lots of different languages. And by now, you've probably had at least one experience where you realize that there are some ideas in one language that just do not exist in other languages, right? That do not translate well. Or some ideas where you can say it in one word in one language, but it takes a whole sentence to say it in a different language, right? And it's kind of like illustrating what von Herder is saying, is that, the culture that we're part of, in many ways, is determined by the language that exists to express that culture. That's his argument. Now, in order to be free, von Herder says that free people need language, but then language, once you speak it, connects you to this emotional world. It connects you to a predefined set of assumptions and beliefs. So they're not neutral things. Languages are not neutral things. They have ideologies by themselves. Right? So here he's trying to balance between this liberal Enlightenment idea of freedom and the Romanticist idea that culture is super important and should be valued, and sort of straddle the two things. Von Herder is, however, trying to distance himself from national chauvinism. This is the idea that your nation is superior, or that you should support it more than anything else, and that there are no competing values, and your nation is the greatest country of them all, or stuff like that. That's what we call national chauvinism, right? So he argues that it's important to pass language and culture between generations and to make sure that a culture is a living culture. But in order for it to be a living culture, it needs to embrace newness as well as tradition. So it needs to keep developing itself over time. So von Herder's idea of the nation is also based on the family, right? This is one reason why in most countries you refer to your country as like the motherland or the fatherland or something like that, right? There's an explicit connection between family metaphors and the nation, right? And that's been generated over time. Now, the negative of this is that not everybody's happy with the concept of the family, right? As we learned in the lecture on feminism, the family is not always a celebrated idea. In fact, many political theorists identify the family as like a source of tension and problem and oppression and that sort of thing. Right? So if you're trying to convince a feminist to be a nationalist, the immediate problem you come into is you use the metaphor of a family and you say, well, the nation is just like a big giant family. And most forms of feminism will reply and say, but the family is a terrible thing, right? It's an oppressive thing. It delivers lots of benefits for you, but not many benefits for me. Right? So why should I like the nation if I can't even like my own family and the way it's structured? Right? So in most nations also, you will never meet or interact with most of the people that you exist in the nation with. Right? At least in an actual family, you can talk to people, they can give you things, resources, love, attention, affection, whatever. Right? But most people in the nation you'll never meet. Right? And the bigger the nation, the less likely you are to meet all the people. Right? So one possible criticism of this family metaphor for the nation is that it seems to give us all of the negatives. Right? It's like the family is something that bosses you around. The family is something that takes things from you. But without any of the positives, right? The nation doesn't necessarily give you very much. Because most of the people in the nation, you're never going to meet. So, on the other hand, we have the relationship between socialism and nationalism. So far we've talked about liberalism or liberals and conservatives and what they believe about the nation. Right? So what do socialists believe about the nation? Well, in early Marxist theory, there was the argument that the working class had no nation of its own. There was something that was going to come in the future where the working class would become politically conscious and create its own nation based on a working class identity. Right? Marx and Engels even argued that as capitalism develops, national divisions would become less important because of globalization and free trade. It would make cultural differences seem to disappear over time. Right? So Marx and Engels suggested that the working class would make themselves into a nation through this development of class consciousness. The more workers are aware of their identity as workers, the closer they would get to nationhood as workers. This is not to say that cultural differences would disappear, but they'd certainly become less important over time, and less important as a way of distributing power and resources. So after Marx, Marx's theory on this national question developed a lot and moved away from this position that workers have no country. They moved towards a different position, mostly because there was a close relationship between national liberation movements and socialist revolutionary movements in practice. Like China is a great example of that, is that where the war against Japan turns into a socialist revolutionary movement. There's a close link between the national liberation movement and the socialist movement. This is the case in many countries, right? So as a result, you see key works like Lenin's Imperialism, the High Stage of Capitalism, or Stalin's The National Question and Leninism, talking about workers having a nation, talking about workers being part of a nation based on language or culture or shared identity or common national characteristics and stuff like that. So reversing the argument that workers had no nation, reversing the argument that national differences didn't matter. Within Maoist political theory, this idea of the nation also takes on special significance, right? And it's unsurprising to think of why. If Maoism and Chinese Marxism as a whole is a response to a context where there's anti-imperialist resistance against Japan, like fighting Japan and the United States, then Maoism basically says there are two types of countries. Either you're an oppressed country, you're being dominated by foreign powers, or you're an imperialist country, you're the one doing the dominating, right? And that the nationalism of the oppressed is necessary. You need nationalism to get free as a nation. But the nationalism of the imperialist countries is illegitimate. Nationalism of an imperialist country leads to the further domination of lots of other people, right? We can see that in this quote from Mao, who says, "Can a communist, an internationalist, who thinks that every worker in the world should be free, at the same time be a patriot, be a nationalist?" And he says that, well, not only can he be, but he must be. And the specific content of patriotism is determined by historical conditions. So in this comparison, he says that there's the nationalism of the Japanese or Hitler in Germany based on dominating other people. Nationalism meant expanding the power of this big empire, becoming more dominant and enslaving and conquering more people. This type of nationalism isn't justified. On the other hand, he said that the victory of China defeating imperialism was a good form of nationalism because it meant that once those invading powers got defeated,